In this valley, the most powerful empire on earth was shattered. Vaslui, Moldavia, January 1475. This fog became a weapon.
40,000 Ottoman soldiers fell here before the sun reached noon.
A nation of farmers and shepherds held the gateway to Europe.
This is how courage and cunning defeated an empire.
In the winter of 1475, the Ottoman Empire marched into a narrow valley in Moldavia, certain it would crush a small principality and open the road into Central Europe. Tens of thousands of soldiers, janissaries in white turbans, Sipahi cavalry gleaming with steel, Wallachian auxiliaries and Tatar raiders all moved north under the command of Hadim Suleiman Pasha, confident that no force on earth could stop them. But what awaited them was not fear, not surrender. It was a people united, silent, and prepared for a deadly ambush. High on the frozen ridges overlooking the valley near Vaslui, Stephen watched. With an army half the size of the force approaching him, every slope, every river crossing, every breath of fog had been shaped for this moment, and when the Ottomans stepped into the heart of the valley, the silence shattered. Arrows fell like black rain from ridges they could not see. Cannons tore through the mist. Cavalry struck from impossible angles and vanished like ghosts. The frozen river split beneath fleeing soldiers, swallowing entire formations into the icy depths. Drums and trumpets echoed from every direction, turning the fog itself into a weapon of terror. And when the mist finally lifted, an empire lay broken across the frozen ground. A small nation had held the gateway to Europe, and the echo of that morning would travel across the continent for centuries. In the late 15th century, Europe trembled beneath the shadow of the crescent moon. The Ottoman Empire had become the most formidable military power on earth, a colossus that had swallowed kingdoms from the shores of the Aegean to the mountains of the Balkans. In 1453, Sultan Mehmed II had achieved what centuries of would-be conquerors could not: the capture of Constantinople, the jewel of Christendom, the city that had stood for over 1,000 years as the heart of the Byzantine world. The bells of Hagia Sophia fell silent. The cross was replaced by the crescent, and from that moment forward, Europe understood that no wall, no army, no prayer alone could guarantee safety from the advancing tide. By the 1470s, the Ottomans controlled nearly everything south of the Danube. Serbia had fallen. Bosnia had been absorbed. The Principality of Wallachia existed only as a vassal, its princes rising and falling at the pleasure of the Sultan. To the north, however, lay a land that refused to bow. Moldavia was a small principality wedged between giants. To its south stretched the Ottoman-controlled Balkans. To the west lay the Kingdom of Hungary. To the north, the vast Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth watched with cautious eyes. Moldavia possessed no great cities, no legendary fortresses, no treasury overflowing with gold. What it possessed was forest, mountains, rivers that flooded in spring and froze in winter, and a prince who understood that survival depended not on strength, but on strategy. Stephen III had taken the throne of Moldavia in 1457, barely out of boyhood, his hands still stained with the memory of his father's blood. His father, Bogdan II, had been murdered by his own brother Petru Aron during a feast meant for celebration. Stephen had watched, Stephen had fled, and Stephen had never forgotten. With the help of his cousin Vlad Tepes, the infamous impaler of Wallachia, he had returned to claim what was rightfully his, driving his treacherous uncle into exile and seizing the throne that had been stolen from his bloodline. From that first moment of power, Stephen ruled with a single understanding. Moldavia survived not because the world allowed it, but because its people made themselves too costly to conquer. For nearly 2 decades, Stephen had navigated the treacherous currents of 15th century politics with the instincts of a survivor. He paid tribute when necessary, smiled at foreign envoys while sharpening his blades in secret, and built a network of fortresses and roads that transformed his small principality into a military machine disguised as a pastoral kingdom. He studied his enemies obsessively. He knew how the Ottomans fought, how they supplied their armies, how they communicated across vast distances. He knew their strengths, their discipline, their terrifying momentum, and he knew their weaknesses. The empire was invincible in open battle on flat terrain where its cavalry could maneuver and its superior numbers could crush any opposition. But in forests, in swamps, in the frozen valleys of the Carpathian foothills, the advantages shifted. There, a smaller force that knew the land could make giants bleed. By 1473, the relationship between Moldavia and the Ottoman Empire had deteriorated beyond repair. Stephen had stopped paying tribute. He had interfered in Wallachia, deposing Ottoman-backed princes and installing his own candidates. He had seized control of Chilia and Cetatea Alba, two crucial ports on the Black Sea coast that the Ottomans considered essential for their control of regional trade and their strategic ambitions. To Sultan Mehmed II, this was not merely defiance, it was an insult. Moldavia, a speck on the map of his vast empire, dared to resist the will of the conqueror himself. And so in late 1474, orders went out from Istanbul. An army would march north. Moldavia would be crushed. Stephen would be brought in chains to kneel before the throne of the Sublime Porte, or his head would be sent instead. The man chosen to lead this expedition was Hadem Suleiman Pasha, the Beylerbey of Rumelia, one of the most experienced commanders in the Ottoman military hierarchy. He was given an army that contemporary sources estimated at anywhere from 60,000 to over 100,000 soldiers. The corps consisted of disciplined Janissary infantry, professional soldiers trained from childhood in the art of war. Around them rode provincial Sipahi cavalry, armored horsemen who had carved their way through every enemy placed before them. Wallachian auxiliaries were conscripted to join the expedition, along with irregular Akanshir raiders and contingents of Crimean Tatars, nomadic warriors whose speed and ferocity had terrorized the steppes for generations. It was an overwhelming force, designed not merely to defeat Moldavia, but to erase it from history. Stephen received word of the invasion through his network of scouts and spies in late autumn. The numbers they reported seemed impossible. Tens of thousands of soldiers were gathering along the Danube, preparing to march north as soon as the campaign season opened. Some of his advisors urged immediate surrender. Others counseled flight, the abandonment of the lowlands in favor of mountain refugees, where a guerrilla campaign might be sustained for years. Stephen listened to all of them. Then he gave orders that would transform Moldavia itself into a weapon. The Yaish strategy was elegant in its brutality. Stephen instituted a scorched earth policy throughout the southern regions of his principality. Villages were evacuated. Their populations moved north into the mountains along with their livestock and stored grain. Wells were poisoned, bridges were burned, every barn, every mill, every storehouse that could not be carried away was put to the torch. The Ottomans would find nothing to sustain them, nothing to shelter them, nothing but ash and silence, and the bitter cold of a Moldavian winter. Meanwhile, light cavalry units were positioned along every route the invaders might take, with orders not to engage in pitched battle, but to harass, to raid supply lines, to pick off stragglers, and above all, to watch. Stephen needed to know exactly where the enemy was moving, exactly how fast, exactly when they would arrive at the place he had chosen for their destruction. That place was a valley near the town of Vaslui, at a location called Podul Inalt, the High Bridge. It was a landscape of marshes, forests, and narrow passages where a large army would struggle to deploy its formations. The Barlad River ran through the valley, crossable only at certain points where wooden bridges spanned the water. Stephen knew this ground intimately. His father had won a great victory against the Poles at this very location in 1450, when Stephen himself was just 17 years old, fighting at his father's side. Now he would fight here again, and he would use every advantage the terrain could offer. Throughout the autumn and early winter, preparations intensified. Trenches were dug beneath layers of snow, invisible to anyone who did not know exactly where to look. Archers and handgunners were positioned on the forested ridges overlooking the valley floor, their positions chosen to maximize the devastation they could inflict while remaining concealed from enemy sight. 20 cannons, small but mobile, were mounted on sleds so they could be moved quickly and fired from unexpected angles. Peasant levies from across Moldavia gathered at the appointed places, men who might lack armor and formal training, but who knew these forests like they knew the faces of their children. Stephen also received a contingent of Zekeli mercenaries from Transylvania, approximately 5,000 experienced fighters who would form the core of his tactical reserve. As December passed into January, the Ottoman army crossed into Moldavia. What they found was a wasteland. The villages they encountered were empty, their wells dry or fouled. The roads were churned to mud or blocked with fallen trees. Each night brought temperatures that froze men in their blankets. Each day brought harassment from Moldavian cavalry that appeared from nowhere, struck with arrows and sabers, and vanished before any response could be organized. The great army that had set out with such confidence was slowly being bled. Horses died, men sickened, supplies dwindled, and still there was no enemy to fight, no force to crush, no victory to claim. Suleiman Pasha pressed forward despite the deteriorating conditions. His scouts reported that there were still intact villages near Vaslui, suggesting that the Moldavians had concentrated their forces in that region. The Ottoman commander saw an opportunity. If he could reach Vaslui and engage Stephen's army directly, his superior numbers would tell. He could still win a decisive victory, capture the Moldavian prince, and salvage the campaign before winter made further operations impossible. He did not realize that the reports of intact villages were deliberately planted information, bait designed to draw him exactly where Stephen wanted him to go. On the morning of January 10, 1475, the Ottoman army entered the valley near Vaslui. A thick fog had settled over the landscape during the night, so dense that men could barely see their own hands before their faces. The mist clung to the frozen ground, swallowing sound, distorting distance, transforming the familiar world into something alien and uncertain. The Ottomans marched forward in long columns, unable to deploy into proper battle formations in the narrow confines of the valley. They could hear water somewhere ahead, the Barlad River, but they could not see where the crossing lay. They could hear birds and the creak of frozen branches, but they could not see the thousands of eyes watching them from the ridges above. Stephen had planned for exactly this moment. The fog was a gift, a natural advantage that multiplied the effectiveness of his ambush tenfold. His forces waited in complete silence, spread across the heights on both sides of the valley floor. Archers held their bows ready, strings taut, eyes straining through the white curtain for the first signs of movement below. Cavalry units crouched beside their horses, breath steaming in the cold air, waiting for the signal that would unleash them. At the center of the valley, a small force of Zekeli mercenaries and Moldavian professional soldiers had been positioned with specific orders. When the enemy appeared, they were to engage briefly, then retreat slowly, drawing the Ottomans deeper into the trap. The first phase of the battle began with sound rather than sight. Moldavian musicians positioned throughout the valley began to play drums and bugles, their echoes bouncing off the hillsides and through the fog in ways that made it impossible to determine their true location. Suleiman Pasha heard what seemed like an entire army directly ahead and ordered his troops to advance. They pushed forward into the mist, following the phantom sounds, stretching their formations thin as they navigated the unfamiliar terrain. The Sekeli forces at the center made contact, exchanged volleys of arrows, then began their planned withdrawal, convincing the Ottomans that they were facing a retreating enemy that could be pursued and destroyed. As the Ottoman columns pushed deeper into the valley, Stephen gave the signal. The fog erupted with fire. Cannons roared from positions on both flanks, their shots tearing through packed formations of men and horses. Arrows fell in black waves from the ridges, thousands of shafts launched by archers who could not see their targets but aimed instead at the sounds of footsteps, the clash of armor, the screams of the wounded. The Ottomans tried to form defensive positions, but they could not see where the attacks were coming from. Officers shouted conflicting orders. Units stumbled into each other in the confusion. The disciplined formations that had conquered half the known world dissolved into chaos. Then came the cavalry. Moldavian horsemen charged out of the fog from multiple directions simultaneously, striking the Ottoman flanks with devastating precision. They appeared like ghosts, sabers flashing, horses screaming, and then vanished again before any organized resistance could form. Light cavalry hit and retreated, never allowing the enemy to pin them down, never giving the Janissaries a stable target against which to direct their fearsome discipline. The fog became a living weapon, concealing the Moldavians and exposing the Ottomans, turning every shadow into a potential enemy, every sound into a harbinger of death. The Ottoman army tried to fall back toward the river, seeking a defensible position where they could regroup and organize a coherent response. But the river crossings had been prepared as killing grounds. Moldavian archers targeted the bridges with concentrated fire. Men who reached the frozen edges of the Barlad River discovered that the ice had been weakened by days of careful work, thinned at key points so that the weight of armored soldiers would send them crashing through into the freezing water below. Hundreds drowned. Hundreds more were struck down by arrows as they struggled to cross. The retreat became a rout. Stephen had held his main force in reserve, waiting until the Ottomans were fully committed, fully disoriented, fully broken. When that moment came, he signaled for the general assault. Trumpets blared through the fog, a single sustained note that every Moldavian soldier recognized. From the ridges, infantry and elite guards swept down into the valley, hitting an enemy already blinded, scattered, and exhausted. Cavalry thundered in from multiple angles, driving the remnants of the Ottoman army against the river and the marshes. The valley became a cauldron of screaming men and dying horses, of steel clashing against steel, of prayers choked short by blood. By midday, the fog began to lift. What it revealed was one of the most devastating defeats the Ottoman Empire had ever suffered. Thousands of soldiers lay scattered across the frozen ground. Others had drowned in the river or disappeared into the marshes, swallowed by the land itself. The survivors fled in all directions, pursued by Moldavian cavalry that hunted them through the forests for days afterward. According to Venetian and Polish records, Ottoman casualties exceeded 40,000 dead. Some chroniclers claimed even higher numbers. Mara Brankovic, the former wife of Sultan Murad II, who had seen the Ottoman military machine at the height of its power, told a Venetian envoy that the defeat at Vaslui was the worst the empire had ever experienced. Among the captured Ottoman standards and prisoners, Stephen found evidence of just how close the empire had come to achieving its objectives. Suleiman Pasha himself barely escaped, protected by his personal guard who sacrificed themselves to cover his flight. Had the fog lifted earlier, had the river not claimed so many, had any one of a dozen small factors turned differently, the day might have ended otherwise. Stephen understood this. He had won not through superior numbers or invincible courage, but through preparation, patience, and the ruthless exploitation of every advantage that terrain and weather could provide. It was a victory of mind as much as muscle, of strategy as much as steel. In the aftermath of the battle, Stephen wrote letters to every Christian ruler who might listen. He sent captured Ottoman commanders and battle standards to Poland, Hungary and Rome, not as trophies of pride, but as warnings. Moldavia had held, he told them, but the empire would return. Mehmed the Conqueror would not accept such a humiliation. The next army would be larger, better supplied, led perhaps by the Sultan himself. If Christendom wished to survive, it must unite. It must send soldiers, gold and prayers to the frontier before the next storm broke. The response from Europe was painfully familiar. Hungary's king Matthias Corvinus claimed credit for the victory in his own communications with Rome, asserting that Hungarian troops had played the decisive role. Poland's King Casimir pleaded poverty and sent nothing but sympathetic words. The Pope awarded Stephen the title of Athleta Christi, Champion of Christ, but the title came without armies. Stephen had saved Europe from the Ottoman advance, and Europe had repaid him with rhetoric. Yet Stephen did not despair. He strengthened his fortresses. He rebuilt his army. He knew that the war was far from over, that Mehmed would return with vengeance burning in his heart. And indeed, the following year, the Sultan himself led an army of perhaps 150,000 men into Moldavia, determined to erase the stain of Vaslui from Ottoman honor. At the Battle of Valea Alba in July 1476, Stephen was defeated in open combat, his forces overwhelmed by sheer numbers. But even then, he refused to surrender. He retreated into the mountains, harassed the Ottoman supply lines, and waited while disease and hunger did what his soldiers could not. The Ottomans captured no major fortresses. They took no lasting territory. And when autumn came, they withdrew, leaving Moldavia wounded but unbroken. Stephen would rule for nearly 3 more decades, fighting battles against Ottomans, Poles, Hungarians and Tatars, winning most and losing few. He built churches and monasteries after every engagement, whether victory or defeat, as penance for the blood shed on both sides. The Voronezh monastery, constructed in 1488, commemorated the victory at Vaslui with frescoes painted in a blue so vivid that art historians would later compare it to the red of Titian. He died in 1504, having ruled for 47 years, having won 34 of his 36 battles, having held together a small nation against empires that should have swallowed it without effort. Today, the valley near Vaslui is quiet. Farmers work the fields. Children play beside rivers that no longer run red. The fog still settles in the low places on winter mornings, thick and cold, swallowing sound and light, just as it did more than 5 centuries ago. If you walk those hills at dawn, local legends say, you can sometimes hear the distant echo of drums, the clash of steel, the thunder of cavalry charging through the mist. They are the sounds of a morning when a small nation refused to die, when courage and cunning combined to break the unstoppable advance of empire, when the gateway to Europe was held by farmers and shepherds who knew their land better than any invader ever could. The victory at Vaslui did not end the Ottoman threat. It did not unite Christendom. It did not bring lasting peace to the Balkans or the Black Sea coast. Within a decade, Moldavia would lose the very ports that Stephen had fought to protect. Within a century, it would become a vassal state, paying tribute to the Sultan just as Stephen's murdered uncle had once agreed to do. History, in the long view, is rarely kind to small nations caught between empires. But there is another way to measure what happened in that frozen valley on January 10th, 1475. For one day, against every calculation of power and probability, a people who had been given no chance demonstrated that will can triumph over numbers, that preparation can overcome strength, that the land itself can become a weapon in the hands of those who truly know it. Stephen the Great understood something that empires often forget. that conquest is not simply a matter of soldiers and supplies, but of spirit. You can occupy territory, you can burn cities, you can scatter armies, but you cannot conquer a people who have decided in the deepest chambers of their hearts that they would rather die free than live in chains. The bells of Moldavian churches still ring on the anniversary of the battle. School children learn the story of the prince who turned fog and ice into weapons, who made the forests themselves fight alongside his men. In Romania, Stephen is remembered as one of the greatest heroes of national history, canonized as a saint by the Orthodox Church in 1992. His image appears on currency. His name adorns streets and monuments and the prayers of the faithful. But perhaps the truest legacy of Vaslui is not found in monuments or prayers. It is found in the simple truth that history preserves, that once, long ago, when the greatest military power on earth came to destroy a small principality of farmers and shepherds, the farmers and shepherds won. They won because they knew their land. They won because they prepared while others doubted. They won because one man saw clearly what was coming and refused to accept that destiny was written by empires alone. The fog has lifted now over the valley of Vaslui. The snow has melted. The rivers flow clear again, carrying their waters toward the sea as they have for millennia. But beneath the soil lie the bones of the forgotten Ottoman and Moldavian alike, men who died far from home for causes they barely understood. And above the valley, when the wind blows cold from the Carpathians, it carries something that sounds almost like a whisper, almost like a prayer, almost like the voice of a prince who stood on a frozen ridge more than 500 years ago and refused to let his nation fall. In the end, that is what Vaslui teaches us. Not that small nations always win, for they do not. Not that courage always triumphs, for it often fails. But that there are moments in history when the expected outcome does not come, when the calculations of power prove insufficient, when the spirit of a people rises to heights that logic cannot explain. In those moments, empires discover their limits, and small nations discover what they are truly made of. Stephen knew what Moldavia was made of. He had seen it in the faces of the peasants who carried their children into the mountains rather than submit. He had seen it in the hands of the smiths who forged weapons through the night. He had seen it in the eyes of the archers who waited in the frozen fog, silent, patient, ready to die for a land that most of the world had never heard of. That faith was vindicated at Vaslui. It was vindicated not by divine intervention or miraculous fortune, but by the oldest and most human of virtues, the willingness to prepare to sacrifice, to stand together when standing alone seemed impossible. The Ottomans would return, the wars would continue. The small nations of Eastern Europe would endure centuries of struggle, occupation, and rebirth. But for one frozen morning in January 1475, the tide was turned, the gateway held, and the echo of that victory would resonate through the ages, a reminder that history is written not only by the powerful, but also by those who refuse to accept that power is destiny. Moldavia survived because its people chose to fight. Stephen the Great earned his name not through the size of his armies or the wealth of his treasury, but through the clarity of his vision and the depth of his commitment to his people. And the valley of Vaslui, where the fog once concealed an ambush that changed the course of European history, remains a testament to what human beings can accomplish when they are defending not merely territory, but identity, not merely borders, but the very essence of who they are. That is the story of Vaslui. That is the legacy of Stephen the Great. And that is why, more than 5 centuries later, the memory of a battle fought in fog and ice and blood still burns bright in the hearts of those who remember what it means to stand, outnumbered and outgunned, and refuse to fall.